Greetings. I would like to welcome you to our daily weekday Mass, held here at the National Shrine of St. Therese on the Carmelite campus in Darien, Illinois. The Carmelites cherish praying and celebrating with you. This shrine is the blessing of a generous gift from the Margie and Robert Peterson Foundation.
Today we're going to be celebrating Saints Joachim and Anne, the grandparents of Jesus. And they have a very important role, I think, to play in the lives of people today. So I'd like to start off by telling you a story, a true story. My first assignment was at St. John's in Leonia, New Jersey. And in those first years, the pastor at the time told me, always be at the doors of the church before and after Mass, because it's the only opportunity the people will see you and you'll see them. So I kept that going. I came there as pastor, and I remember at 9:30 Mass, after everything got started, I started heading back to our house, which was just down the block. Get to the corner, there's a stop sign, and all of a sudden the van pulls up, and it's driven by a friend of mine, a member of the parish. Her name was Celeste. She motions me to cross the street. I motion her to go. She motions me to cross the street. I motion her to go. So we're both laughing. She rolls down the window and she says to me, "What's the matter? Don't you trust me?" And I said to her, "Celeste, I know you well enough that I could get to the front of that van. You're going to step on the gas, run me over, back up, and do it all over again to make sure you did it right." And she's laughing more. Her son, Mike, is next to her in the front seat, about 15 at the time. And he says to me, "Father, I would never do that to you." And I said, "Gee, Mike, I'm glad to hear that." Then he said, "I make sure I do it right the first time." Well, by now, Celeste is almost on the street laughing. And I said to her, "Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it, Celeste?" And the only thing she could say was, "The poor kid never had a chance." And the truth is, none of us had a chance. If Mike was here today, and you had an opportunity of spending time with him, not only would you see Mike, you would see his parents and his grandparents. That twisted sense of humor that he showed that day, that comes from his mom. The way he works, the outgoing personality, comes from both parents. The way he takes care of problems, that's his dad at work in him. The fingerprints are all over him. And adding to that is that Mike's two grandmas lived with them on the second floor of their house. Celeste told me that he would spend a great deal of time with them. He would talk with them, watch television with them, and listen to their stories. There's a very strong bond that existed between Mike and his grandmas. They provided a strong bridge, not only to Mike, but to their parents. They were the first generation Americans. Their parents came from Italy. All the foods, all the family celebrations, all the ways they celebrated holidays, the favorite saints in that particular village that Mike's great-grandparents grew up in, all of that was alive in them. They witnessed to their faith. Even when they couldn't make it to church anymore because of age, they made sure that someone was coming to their house in order to give them Holy Communion. They showed Mike and his parents never to let go of the faith, stay in touch with it, live it. They became witnesses of a different time and a different place, not only with the stories that they told, but the family customs and traditions and values and special meals that they did their best to keep alive so they could pass it on to another generation. I did some remembering of my own, with my grandparents. I grew up with my dad's mom. They came to my hometown of Norwood in the late 1940s, early 1950s, from Brooklyn. Strong German background. The house that my grandma bought was 3 stories and very old. Part of it would be rented out in order to help keep it going. But not only did my grandma bring her furniture from Brooklyn into that house, she also brought the way of life that she received. While in Brooklyn, she got used to going out to the curb and sweeping, making sure that everything was clean. She taught me to do the same in my hometown. She was a very neat and tidy woman. She saw something on the floor. She would keep saying, pick it up, and look how much better it makes the place look when you keep it clean. And I'm finding I do the same exact thing. She brought traditions of St. Nicholas and Christmas that became an important part of our life. On the eve of St. Nicholas, we would hang up our socks, and the next morning there'd be small pieces of candy and small toys, trinkets in the socks, and we would go to school and we would say to the kids, what did you get for St. Nicholas? What did you get? And they looked at us as if we had 2 heads. That wasn't their tradition. They never received a custom like that. And on Christmas Eve, the tree went up. Never, ever earlier than that. And it wasn't decorated. That was always done by Santa Claus. And so the next morning, the whole room was transformed. She used to get up early in the morning and take me to the first Mass on Sunday. And I'm still an early riser because of her. But there were also things that she did that I thought were very weird and strange. She never cooked with butter or oil, only salt. And when we had a birthday party in our house, and my mom would buy those fancy birthday paper plates, she never threw them out. She washed them. They could be used again. And I can even remember toilet paper folding into the clean water. She'd pull it out and dry it off, and we would use it. Kind of strange, right? But as I got older, I realized she lived through the Depression in the rationing of World War II. That's what she learned. And that's what she passed on to us. Never waste anything. Stretch things out as much as possible and learn to do without. So at the ripe old age of 66 and earlier than that, I still sew socks to make them last, or shirts. I'm careful on how money is spent, and I look for sales. There's a Dutch expression, we grow too fast old, too late smart. And I can appreciate now what my grandma went through. On my mom's side, I never knew my grandparents. My mom's mom was killed in a car accident. Her dad died a few months after I was born. But she told the stories, and she made them come alive for us. My grandma grew up on a small farming town in Pennsylvania. She was Mennonite. She converted to a Catholic faith after she met my granddad, fell in love, and they got married. She was a staunch Catholic. and she helped start the parish church in my hometown, the church where I was baptized, received First Communion, confirmation, and even was ordained and celebrated my first Mass. She loved putting together flower beds and vegetable gardens. So do I. She would put together care packages and leave them at the doors of people she knew she was struggling during the worst days of the Depression. My granddad was from Lynn, Massachusetts, but he loved Boston. So do I. He was a very smart man. And from what my mom said, he was too smart because he didn't have patience for people who couldn't pick up things as quickly as he did. Heavily involved in politics and church, big into tracing the family tree, which I find interesting. So between my dad's mom and my mom's parents, they created powerful memories. And I fell in love with the simpler times that they lived through and all the places they've seen. They gave incredibly good memories that shaped my brothers and my sisters, and we tried our best to keep alive. I think if you took time and recalled your parents and grandparents, good memories would be stirred up. Things that they did for you. Maybe walks that they took you on. Going to see you at a sporting event. Reading stories. Family customs and traditions that were passed along to you. And we begin to see in ourselves some of the things that they said and they did. As much as you might think, I'm not going to be my father, I'm not going to be my grandparents, I'm not going to be anyone but me, you might end up saying the same exact things they said and think, where did that come from? But that just shows the impact and the fingerprints that people have in our lives. Just as with Mike, we can see our parents and our grandparents very, very well. Was what we received always perfect? No. Like them and us, there's always a struggle of living the faith, in being human beings, of dealing with weakness and sin that affects us all. But even the negative aspects of their lives that you might have experienced or seen or heard, that is what they received. That was passed on from one generation to the next to the next. It's all they knew. That's all they had to offer. In the Broadway musical, South Pacific, there's a very unsettling song, I think, that illustrates that. You got to be taught to hate and fear. You got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ears. You've got to be carefully taught. That became a harsh reality to my parents a number of years ago. Right next to our house, new neighbors moved in. They had 3 sons who became super good friends of my 3 brothers. If you saw one, you saw the other. They were always over at the house. One day, the youngest, who was about 7, was at the kitchen table. And my mom asked him, "What do you want to do when you get older?" And without blinking an eye, this 7-year-old said, "I want to get a gun and kill the Jews." That family came from the Middle East. That's what they saw. That's what they lived through with all the wars and violence. The youngest was carefully taught by that world and also his family. The same can be seen in the Scriptures. We can see in the people of Scripture values and outlooks that were passed on from one generation to the next. tremendous acts of faith, a living relationship with God, a sense of holiness and of living covenant and law in order to show that they belong to Him. But there were also acts of sin and breaking commandments. In the first book of Kings, the names of the kings of Judah and Israel are mentioned. And 99% of the time, there's that same refrain that keeps coming up. They did evil in the sight of God, walking in the ways of their fathers. Fingerprints from the past that affect the present and also the future. You can only give away what you received. And unless conversion takes place, unless a person decides they don't want to live that life, and with a conscious effort, change with the grace of God, to live differently, to think differently, to speak differently, whatever they received, they'll give. But there are also the holy ones of Scripture. And that's where the story of Joachim and Anne has deep roots. Their lives reflect earlier couples that you can read about in the Scripture who are unable to have children. Abraham and Sarah, for instance, in the book of Genesis, where the angel tells Sarah she's going to have a son. And she starts laughing because she thinks the folks in Medicare are never going to accept this bill. Manoah and his wife from Judges, the book of Judges. An angel comes and announces the birth of a son, and his name will be Samson, one of the great leaders of his people. Another man, Elkanah, has 2 wives, and one of them, Hannah, is unable to have children. And the other wife makes her life miserable by reminding her of that fact. She stands in the temple, crying, praying to God. And she becomes pregnant with a child that she'll call Samuel, one of the great prophets of Israel. And then there was Elizabeth and Zechariah, unable to have children, until Gabriel announces to Zechariah he'll have a son, and he'll be named John, who prepares for the coming of the Christ. I don't think the parents would have kept that quiet. They would have passed on the stories to their sons. The meeting of the angel, God coming and answering their prayers, tears being wiped away, all because of this unbelievable God. So they received from their family and their extended family an unbelievable faith in God, in covenant and commandments to live. And not just words, but they could look at their parents and grandparents and see lives that spoke very powerfully, giving credible witness to the faith that they told the stories of. So that if you looked at Samson, if you looked at Isaac, if you looked at Samuel, if you looked at John, you could see their parents and their grandparents and God at work through the lives of those ancestors. And it was no different with Joachim and Anne. There's nothing in the Scriptures about the lives of these 2 saints. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke will trace the family tree of Jesus on the side of Joseph, showing that he's the promise of God's coming Savior. His mom's side is neglected. We know nothing of them, nothing of Mary's ancestors, except that she has a sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and a cousin, Elizabeth. Outside of that, nothing, except that they existed. Where we do find information about Joachim and Anne and their names come from 2 sources. The Gospel of James, that was written about the year 150, and the Gospel of the Nativity of Mary, that was written sometime in the 3rd century. Neither Gospel is accepted as inspired by God. The name Joachim comes from the Hebrew, which means to whom God has set up. And the name An comes from the Hebrew, which means he, God, has favored me. All the information we have about these two people are found in those sources. Anne was born in Bethlehem. Joachim was a very wealthy and pious man who regularly cared for the poor. They married and they lived in Nazareth. But they faced a great burden. Like the others that I mentioned to you, they were childless. They couldn't have any children at all. Joachim went to the temple to offer sacrifice, but his sacrifice was rejected. He was reproached for his sterility and not having any children. And at that time, it was seen as God's displeasure that they did something wrong. So immediately he goes to the desert, and for 40 days and 40 nights, he's in prayer and in fasting, doing penance. Anne doesn't know any of this. She's at home. She doesn't know what's happened to him. So she's depressed over the lack of her husband's presence and also her inability to have a child. So she makes a promise to God. If given a child, Anne promises that that child will be dedicated to the Lord's service. So both receive, on separate times, a visit from an angel, announcing that Anne would conceive and would have a wondrous child. So there's great rejoicing when this daughter is born, and Anne names her Mary. When she was 3 years old, her parents fulfilled the promise made to God, brought her to a temple in Jerusalem to have her raised. If you look at Mary, you begin to discover what Joachim and Anne were like. There's a heroism and a holiness of the people that was part of the family life that Mary lived. We're able to see in Mary the fulfillment of many generations of faith-filled men and women. She was immersed in the religious traditions of her people. Her ancestors lived covenant and loved God and gave that gift to her. So there are aspects of her personality that show something of her parents. She had a strong character in making decisions, and that's evident in the Annunciation, when Gabriel comes and makes the request of being the Father's Son. It's important to keep in mind that Mary would have been about 16 or 17 at the time. No details were given. No one told her what it would cost her or what exactly her son would do. A lot of things hanging in the air. And yet, she gives her yes. And I think part of the reason is that her parents would have passed on to her all the great things that God had done for his people in bringing them out of Egypt, in saving them from exile, in providing for them, remaining faithful to the covenant, never dropping them, never walking away from them. And if this is a God that faithful, that committed to his people, why should she be any different or be afraid? So from her parents' living faith, Mary is able to give a yes that changes the world. She practices prayer, ongoing prayer. In the Gospel of Luke, when the shepherds hear the voices of the angels and go to see the great things that have been done, Luke says in chapter 2, verse 19, she kept all these things, reflecting them in her heart. When she finds her son in the temple, Luke writes, his mother kept all these things in her heart. When she was in the upper room after the ascension and waiting for the gift of the Spirit, Luke writes in Acts, all these devoted themselves with one accord to prayer, together with some women and Mary, the mother of Jesus. She searches for God. No stone is left unturned. She gives her full attention and time, and the relationship grows with God. Another gift from her parents, who worshiped, prayed, and lived what they prayed. Mary was also devoted to the laws and the practices of our faith. She, along with Joseph, bring Jesus to the temple to fulfill the law that the son had to be consecrated to God. Her family would have practiced the same faith, the same customs and traditions. And she was very steady. She had a steadiness in a crisis. She goes with Joseph to Bethlehem because of the census and separated from her larger family. She goes into exile into Egypt with Joseph and her son. Her son leaves home and begins his mission. And she stands near his cross on Calvary. She continues to believe and refuses to allow a crisis to shake that faith or her confidence in the promises of God. And she's also devoted to her family and relatives. Faith is lived, not just with words, but with actions. When Elizabeth was pregnant, she went to take care of her. When she goes to that wedding feast in Cana and she sees the wine run out, very embarrassing, she intercedes for the married couple with her son. Looking at Mary, you see the fingerprints of Joachim and Anne all over her. Their lives indicate a close-knit and loving family that trusted in God, faithfully followed the law and covenant, and practiced their faith. And they and their ancestors helped prepare and give a setting for the coming of the Messiah, enabling total and complete abandonment to God. All this was done on a daily basis. All this was done in obscurity. Now, what does that have to do with you as grandparents and parents? I'd like you to do some daydreaming. What do you want people to see when they look at your grandchildren? What are the Christian values and way of life that you want to see come alive in them? How will your grandchildren regard those in need? Treat others. Become involved in their parishes, in neighborhoods. We live in a society that's radically different than the one that we experienced when we were younger. We live in a cancel culture now. Those with the loudest voices win. In a society that's increasingly divorcing itself from Christ and His Father. So if we want grandchildren to grow up and be filled with values, they need to be shared with what we have received from previous generations. Many of you might remember the name Krista McAuliffe, who was the first non-military person who went into space. She was a teacher devoted to her students. She saw her life as a vocation, not a job. And she would always say, I touch the future. I teach. So how do you touch the future? Let me share with you a composition that was written by a third grader. I found this 40 years ago. Now, this is a kid looking at his grandma, and this is what his grandma is like. What is a grandmother? A grandmother is a lady who had no children of her own. She likes other girls and boys. A grandfather is a man-grandmother. He goes for walks with the boys, and he talk about fishing and stuff like that. Grandmothers don't have to do anything except be there. They are so old they shouldn't play hard or run. It's enough if they drive to the market where they pretend horses and have lots of dimes ready. Or if they take us for walks, they should slow down past things like pretty leaves and caterpillars. They should never say, hurry up. Grandmothers are usually fat, but not too fat to tie your shoes. They wear glasses and funny underwear. They can take their teeth and gums off. Grandmothers don't have to be smart. Only answer questions like, why isn't God married? And why do dogs chase cats? Everybody should try to have a grandmother, especially if you don't have a TV, because they are the only ones among the grown-ups who have the time. That's where it starts. Time. So give your grandchildren a precious gift, yourself, and time. Be willing to listen and hear what they have to say. What do they find exciting? What gives them joy? What is troubling them? What are their fears and their problems? For them, that's real. And they want to be taken seriously and not discounted. So make yourselves vulnerable and share your life, your experiences, to give them the sense, geez, I'm not the only one who feels this way. There's someone else. And be ready to love them deeply. Don't worry about giving them stuff. Kids these days have a lot of stuff. But what they need are significant people who are willing to share their affection in themselves. Go for walks. Read stories to the little ones. Ask their help in some small project. Things that share time and presence together. And tell them you love them. Show them that there's an alternative to contemporary values. Let Christ live in you. Work with parents in raising them in the practice of our faith. If you bring them to church, explain the things in the church to them. Read them Bible stories or lives of the saints. Teach them prayers that you were taught to show that God is with us all the time. We do have a community in heaven, a communion of saints ready to help us. So call upon Joachim and Anne for guidance and strength. Seek your own prayer life and relationship with Christ that will touch everything that you say and do, so that you can become a credible witness to the Catholic faith, to your grandchildren and others. As I mentioned, the faith is passed on not by what we say, but how it's lived. Do it all, one day at a time, always, one day at a time. Just as you could look at Mike and see his parents and grandparents, let others see Christ alive in you. And that will be a great and lasting gift that you give to your children, grandchildren, and all others. Thank you very much.